Welcome to the Emisarios Unidos de Luz channel. If you enjoy this near-death experience story, consider giving it a like and subscribing to the channel. Now let's start with the story. From the age of 14, I suffered from anorexia, and by the age of 25, I was severely ill and weighed only 64 pounds. Despite receiving various therapies, there was no significant improvement in my condition. Eventually, my kidneys began to fail, and I refused to receive any further treatment for my condition. Although I didn't have a close relationship with God, I prayed to Him, offering my life in exchange for His help. One night, I suddenly woke up as I began to suffocate in my sleep. My body started shaking violently, and moments later, I popped out of my body. I was floating above my body, then above the house, and finally within the bounds of the most astonishingly beautiful landscape that I knew was heaven. In heaven, upon recognizing my grandmother, whom I hadn't seen in a long time and deeply missed, I very enthusiastically began to approach her. My grandmother, who in heaven appeared to be about 30 years old, said she had been waiting for me. My grandfather, who was with her, kept repeating, "Look what I can do," as he walked on his hands. "Do you want to meet Jesus?" my grandmother asked. "Yes," I screamed. Jesus, tall and slim with dark brown hair and eyes, suddenly appeared in front of us. When I looked at him, I started to cry because I could feel his compassion for me. Jesus comforted and consoled me as I shared my concerns with him, affirming that he knew everything I had experienced and that everything was going to be all right. "Do you promise?" I asked him. "Yes," he replied. I told him, "You are a very handsome man," which made Jesus laugh. I then began to laugh, and our shared levity made us laugh even more. I felt so lucky to have his complete attention, especially considering the number of people surrounding us. "Go back to your earthly life and tell everyone what you have seen and experienced in heaven," he said. "I will," I replied. Jesus then gave me a parting hug that felt like 1,000,000 volts of electricity passing through my body. As I sat in bed thinking about my experience, I felt disappointed to no longer be in Jesus' presence and to be back in a world where everyone seemed so cruel. I could still feel the sensation of electricity passing through my body from when Jesus hugged me, and I was able to fall asleep again. The next morning, when I woke up, I felt unusually hungry. For the first time in 11 years, I ate a full meal without experiencing any discomfort. That day was my scheduled appointment with the doctor, who examined me and performed some tests. During a follow-up consultation a few days later, I was shocked to find out that my kidneys were healthy. "I cannot explain your miraculous recovery," he said. Thanks to Jesus, my body and soul were healed, and I began to gain weight again. 9 years later, I weighed 135 pounds, more than double what I weighed before my NDE. Today, I can't think about Jesus without crying. I feel so blessed to have been in his presence, healed by his touch, and to have experienced his immense compassion for me. I have not experienced such compassion or love in my earthly life. You may wonder why my grandfather was so eager for me to see him walking on his hands. Although the experience was vivid and real to me, my mother never believed me when I told her about my time in heaven. I remembered that Jesus said to tell everyone, but it took 9 years before I shared it with anyone. When I finally told my mother about my NDE, I mentioned seeing Grandpa and how excited he was to show me he could walk on his hands. I noticed her face turned very pale, so I asked if she was okay. My mother explained that when my grandfather was a teenager, he used to walk on his hands to impress people. She said he was very good at it and enjoyed showing off. "Someone must have told you about how your grandfather used to do that for you to know," she reasoned, even though no one in my family had ever mentioned such stories about him. These days, I am comforted by the knowledge that if my life were to suddenly end, heaven would be the home I return to, where I would be reunited with my family and with Jesus. I have shared my NDE with others, but as you might imagine, most people don't believe it was something I actually experienced. I always remember the Bible verse that says to be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord. At least, that has been my experience. Story 2. As a teenager, I was an angry person who felt very isolated from others. Although I grew up in a Christian family, I remained agnostic, reasoning that if God existed, he must be indifferent to allow so much misery and suffering in the world, and I wasn't interested in an indifferent God. One evening, I sneaked out of the house to attend a bonfire party I had been invited to. My friends and I were offered drugs at the party, which we willingly accepted, even though we didn't know anything about what we were taking. I was caught off guard by how potent the substance was and how quickly it took effect, as I began to hallucinate shortly after taking it. Because I wasn't in an emotionally happy place at that time in my life, the hallucinations I experienced while under the influence of the drug were horrendous. In my helplessness to stop those hideous creatures from surrounding me, I began to despair. Further into that fated excursion, I became increasingly panicked and terrified as the faces of the people around me at the party began to morph into those of demons and monsters. Unable to find refuge from those grotesque forms, I ended up jumping into the bonfire in an attempt to escape them. Almost instantly, I began to experience agonizing pain as my body became engulfed in flames, and there I remained until one of the kids at the party noticed and rescued me. I don't remember much of what happened afterwards, but I was told that the kids decided to hide me to avoid drawing the attention of the authorities, as we were all trespassing on private land. After the kids attempted to clean me up, I was left in the dark and away from everyone. Given the state of my body, I knew I was going to die, so I prayed repetitively to whoever was listening to release me soon. Someone must have heard my prayer because not long after I passed out, I found myself out of my body, traveling through a pitch-black tunnel before suddenly landing on a dark and rugged expanse. As a grey mist swirled around me in that barren and somber domain, I looked skyward to behold a field of stars in an unfamiliar sky. As dreadful and unforgiving as that place seemed, it was so quiet that all I could hear was the sound of the whirling wind. As I scanned the panorama around me, I noticed to my right a towering, ancient-looking stone wall that I recognized was part of an enormous city wall. Even in the silence of what I realized was the city's night, I could hear a melody so sublime that it made my heart ache to listen to it. That music, so beautiful, so beguiling, and so unlike any music familiar to me, stirred my soul so deeply that all I wanted to do in that moment was find its source. Even now, when I recall the melody that embodied a love and hope so exalted and so eminent, I still feel the same upliftment, the same stirring in my heart, and the same soulful longing I felt during the NDE. It was at that moment that I realized that I could be whole in my solitude. I don't know how, but I somehow knew I was light years away from Earth. Despite being so far away, I could still feel a remnant of the pain I had experienced moments before, and it wasn't until I noticed the tether to my earthly body, trailing off to the left, that I understood why. Knowing that my earthly body was dying, I was ecstatic at the prospect of the bond being permanently severed with that which, in my spirit-body awareness, I regarded as utterly alien and detestable. It was at that moment that I was approached by a light being or a guide. That beautiful, glowing, being of light that I couldn't tell whether was male or female, radiated a calm intelligence, and it was in the shroud of its radiance that it became irrefutably evident to me that God did indeed exist. I began to swell with rage as I blamed God for the world's problems, especially my own. The guide, however, didn't react to my anger at all. Instead, it stood in front of me, radiating calm acceptance and love, but its profound state of peace only made me angrier. A chessboard suddenly appeared where my feet would have been. Why? Is this some sort of game? A joke? I asked as I tried to rein in my temper. The guide communicated to me telepathically. You choose to live your life on Earth, and you choose your suffering, the guide replied, words that shocked me into silence. Only an idiot would choose that life, I said, expressing my incredulity. With my composure restored, the light being and I had a conversation in which it answered my questions. The guide explained to me that we are eternal beings whose essence is love energy. Personal growth is more difficult to achieve in that form, however, and it is for personal growth that we choose to incarnate on Earth. It explained too that there is no limit to the number of times we can incarnate on Earth. It explained to me that facing the challenge of living in love and making love our priority and the answer to our problems was our ultimate test and our ultimate challenge. The guide explained that if we made love the focus and foundation of every thought, we wouldn't be inclined to create distinctions based on race, religion, politics, money, or nationality, because none of these things matter to one who is focused on love. In the oversoul state of awareness, where I experienced oneness with the greatness that I, and we all, truly are, my earthly life seemed somewhat trivial, and I didn't want to return. I wanted to stay in that place I considered my home, but the guide kept reminding me of my earthly mission and duty. When the guide mentioned my mission, I experienced a moment of clarity about what I had come to Earth to achieve, and the awareness of my mission gave me pause. There are children that need to be born, that you will give birth to, the guide revealed, and he or she reminded me of how much I loved my boyfriend. Although her reasons didn't fully satisfy me, a part of me still desired to return and complete my earthly mission. I thought about returning to a damaged body, and sensing my concern, I felt my guide healing me through the tether. When I awoke in my body after reuniting with it, I was still alone in the woods and could feel the pain again. Although it took some time, I eventually reached the hospital, where I remained for several months in recovery. Thanks to the healing work the guide performed through the tether, my body healed to a degree that exceeded the doctor's expectations. Since my return, I haven't felt the anger I once had towards my family and life.